your own companies. So I have a couple questions I'd like to start off with. One, what sparked your interest and brought you down the path of high tech and cybersecurity? And then two, what is the story around why you moved from the banking industry into one of the most globally visible and politically charged IT positions as CIO of the White House?
Yeah, no, thank you. It's a great question. Thank you, Nathan and Matt and EchoStor for having me and everybody for attending today. I I think I'm an example of, I often say where I am right now, it's a career that chose me. It wasn't sort of my chosen career at the time. I'm also a faith-based person, so I always say a lot of these events that led to me being where I am now is a God thing. But I'm an example of having a mandatory computer programming class in high school, where that could lead for somebody. And so I was going to a Department of Defense school on the U.S. Marine Corps base, Quantico, where my daddy was stationed. He was the crew chief for Marine One, which is the HMX One is the helicopters that transport the president and the vice president. And we had mandatory computer programming. And I don't know if I would have taken computer programming if it wasn't mandatory. I'm not sure. But I got in the class and realized I love this and I'm good at it. And so that just sort of sparked this interest for me. But when I went off to college, I thought to myself, I think what I want to do is international finance, go to law school and run for US Senate. So that was kind of, if you had asked me kind of where I was headed, I was going to do sort of international finance, work with artificial intelligence, behavioral based analytics, law school, and I haven't done the law school or run for US Senate. I still got time, I guess, if I decide to do that. And then funny enough, my husband was stationed at Mayport, which is in Jacksonville, Florida. So as I left graduate school at University of Virginia, looking for a job in Jacksonville, Florida, which at that time wasn't really a hotbed of sort of cutting edge transformational technology. I just lucked upon a very forward looking team at Barnett Bank, which is now part of Bank of America. And when I told them what I wanted to do, they took a chance on me and brought me in and put me on some special projects. I still had to kind of do some of the core banking technology systems that they had, but I got to work on transformation and innovation projects for them. Now, when you do that, you end up being on the cutting edge of not only customer service delivery, but also on the cutting edge of fraud. We didn't even call it cybercrime yet. And that's when sort of this like a switch just sort of flipped for me. And my whole family is law enforcement and US military. And I thought, wait a minute, I'm trying to design these amazing systems for our customers to basically transform how they do banking, where they live, where they work. And these bad people are getting in the way between the bank and the customers. I've got to figure something out here. And so I always ask for that responsibility for risk, fraud, and security, in addition to delivering cutting edge technologies. Fast forward, I got a phone call that I thought was social engineering. So I almost didn't return the call, saying that President George W. Bush had a position open for a chief information officer. And I thought, I don't know anybody there. I don't know how they know me. This cannot be right. And so I actually called back pretty cheeky because I was pretty convinced that I was going to unveil some social engineers. And it actually was the White House. So I kind of had to apologize, but they said it was like, should be a litmus test for all CIOs that they would be that skeptical. So that started my journey over to the White House. And while I was there working on these transformation efforts, being read into special programs and seeing the capabilities of nation states, cyber criminal, like true organized criminal syndicates that I hadn't seen yet in my time in banking, I knew that I was going to spend the rest of my career focused on evangelizing for businesses, government organizations, nonprofits, and individuals. Here's what you need to do. Here's what's coming at you next. Here's how you need to prepare. And here's what you can do to outthink and outmaneuver the bad guys.
Very cool. Yeah, and things have changed significantly since then too. I mean, we've had exponential advancements in technology. You know, we have 24/7 SOCs, we have advanced firewalls, XDR, MFA. There's a ton of frameworks out there defined by NIST to help customers achieve a robust security posture. Yet attackers still find their way in. Companies spend a ton of money on security initiatives. What are your thoughts on what organizations might be missing as they build these cybersecurity strategies? And what steps can they take to improve?
It's a fantastic question because whether, I say there ends up oftentimes being in kind of corporate America and even nonprofits and government organizations. I call them the haves and the have-nots. So you end up having like large organizations where they set aside large budgets for cybersecurity, for mitigating risk. They've got big teams, really talented people, lots of tools. And so those are the haves. Then you've got other organizations who, through no fault of their own, their margins are tight. They're in an industry where maybe there's a lot of technology that still works, but it's kind of old, but it was really expensive to invest in. So they're trying to get the longest lifespan they can on those investments. And I call those the have-nots. And it really doesn't matter. Cyber criminals don't say, oh, that's a sophisticated cybersecurity strategy organization. I'm not going to bother. I'm just going to go after the people who didn't invest in cybersecurity and technology transformation efforts. Nope, they go after everybody. So by nature of being connected to the internet, by nature of having something that can be targeted, that can be monetized, productized, and sold to other cyber criminal syndicates, everyone is a target. So I love what you said there too about, things have changed. So we thankfully have some incredible frameworks. NIST is one of many. And what I would want people to take away from sort of, because it sounds a little onerous sometimes to say, I'm going to follow all these compliance checklists, like, oh, here's the 1,000 things I'm not doing right. And when will I ever get a chance to fix these? Like, we're not a cybersecurity company. We're in the business of doing X, Y, Z to serve our customers, right? And so I always say to companies, what you want to be thinking about, a great place to start is boil it down to what are your user stories? How do you want your customers to feel about you when they interact with you in person or via alternate delivery channels? How do you want your employees to feel about their experience, taking care of the mission of the operation, taking care of the customer? Those user stories, really understand those user stories and where technology plays a role, because that's where you then take those compliance frameworks and understand how to actually secure the human. My concern is in the industry, we've gotten so focused on what tools do I have? What tools do I not have? What framework am I? And the last person we talk about, the last thing we talk about in the whole equation is the actual human. But flip it around and you look at the studies, there's a Stanford study that says 88% of the last 12 to 18 months of cyber incidents were due to human error. There was an IBM study done pre-pandemic that said 95% of the 2 years they looked at were due to human error. Why do we talk about tools, process, frameworks all up front, but the last thing we talk about is what is the user story and human-centered design?
Yeah, that's great. And I know, so I've listened to your TED Talks and things like that. And you did have one of the things you mentioned was we need to stop designing cybersecurity to work against human nature and start using human nature to work against cybersecurity. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't know about you, Matt, but have you ever had somebody that's not in the cybersecurity or risk and compliance community run up to you and say, hey, Matt, did you design strong passwords? Because I am so happy to meet you. Thank you for creating those. The longer, the better. The more special characters, the better. The shorter expiration date. It's awesome. Like I've never had anybody thank me for strong password requirements, but we know that they're important because that's just the way we've designed the user story and the user experience. We're talking about in the future going passwordless. and creating more of a user story based on behavioral based analytics and emerging technologies to allow, it's not just biometrics, it's a combination of things that come together and say, yep, I'm pretty sure this is Matt, and I'm okay taking a risk it might not be him based on this level of transaction. Once the person who pretends to be Matt or or is Matt starts to do something more complex or more sensitive, I'm going to ask for a lot more data. And maybe at that point I ask for a password, or maybe I ask for something else. So to me, where we have to evolve our thinking is, yes, it's very important that we train people not to click on links and visit unsafe sites and not to open attachments. But you know what? Most people's jobs, like, I don't know about you, but when I worked for President George W. Bush, if I said, my inbox is just not safe today, sir, so I'm just not even going to open up any emails, I don't think that would have gone over well. So we have to, sort of find that right balance of how do we help people be productive, get the job done, while at the same time, how do we secure them and think differently about that security?
Yeah, and that could introduce some new threats or risks associated with that as well. So I think everyone's heard of the Internet of Things, and now we're kind of talking about the Internet of Behaviors and storing a lot of these behavioral aspects of voices and faces, emotions, and things like that. And it's starting to get a lot more attention. So what can we do as individuals and perhaps as companies that might be storing this data to protect ourselves against its misuse?
Yeah, so one thing you can do to protect against the misuse of the Internet of Behaviors, of biometrics, but also be prepared for anything that impacts your operational resiliency, recoverability, and reliability. That is your out of band, encrypted storage and backups, right? Where you create a multi-factor authentication access to those backups. So be thinking about, where do I have risk? Where do I really want to mitigate risk? And how do I find kind of the right solutions and partners? Because it'll help you with the Internet of Behaviors. It'll help you with operational resilience and reliability, to be thinking about, where do I store that information? How do I store it? Do I encrypt it in motion and at rest? When somebody has a need, whether it's authentication, authorization, or delivering some type of a experience online, and I have a need to access that data, do I actually tokenize that request? Do I leave it wide open for any application that's trying to access it? Or do I say, first of all, let me see, are you an application I even recognize? Okay, secondly, let's authenticate you. Okay, now let's do the authorization. And then lastly, before I give you access, I'm actually going to tokenize the request. And the good news is, Matt, the technology, this used to be something we would talk about, and it would be inelegant, expensive, and clunky to implement. But the technology is really starting to get to the point where you can actually do this in a seamless, cost-effective manner.
Absolutely. So I know I've got a question that I think everyone's going to be interested in. At this point, throughout your experience in both private sector and public sector, you've dealt with a number of cyber attacks. Is there a specific threat that stands out among the others? How did you overcome that threat? And what improvements did you make, whether these are technological improvements or procedural improvements, to reduce the risk of that same event happening again?
It's a tough one to pick just one.
Mhm.
I'll talk about a proactive one, because I think it's a great example of, if you think about your user stories, if you think about what you're in the business of doing, and then identify a playbook that's based upon your worst nightmare, like, what is the worst thing that could happen? And so we had an organization who, let's just say, they create very important chemicals. Those very important chemicals are made around the globe in manufacturing plants that you probably wouldn't even notice they were there unless you worked there. And some of these chemicals are highly volatile chemicals. And if something were to happen to one of those manufacturing plants, it would be a terrible hazmat situation for many miles. And so they actually we helped them sort of articulate their worst nightmares about the different chemicals and the different manufacturing processes and plants. And then we did a very comprehensive, kind of quarter by quarter. We would spend some time on a playbook. We would ethically hack. Some people refer to it as red teaming, offensive cyber operations. And we were able to show them where the defenses they put in place would work against different types of adversaries. And then we were able to show them how basically an adversary with advanced techniques, time, how they could over time actually access one of the plants. And we basically took video. We stopped short of changing the temperature on the plant, but we took video of like how we would do it. And then we quickly called somebody and talked to them through how to mitigate having that vulnerability before we published our report to them. So that's an example where, you don't have to spend lock everybody in a room for a year and spend, tons of time and tons of resources and not get other things done. You can, in a very much a crawl, walk, run approach, be thinking over time, making policy changes, leveraging investments you've already made and tweaking those, education and awareness, and then just sort of going around and sort of ethically hacking and trying to figure out where are things working as designed, and then where do we have vulnerabilities that have to be mitigated. And so that to me, I think speaks volumes to, on any budget, on any size staff, you can make progress. This is a company where it's very expensive to operate. Margins can be very slim depending on what's going on with fuel prices and global supply chain. And so they had to manage their money, but they also wanted to be secure, and it can be done.
Absolutely. So a lot of security focused folks are seen as perhaps impeding innovation or getting in the way of progress. Do you have any suggestions for the IT professionals on the phone, or perhaps security folks on the phone today, to help them champion some of these security initiatives and get everyone else in these organizations more excited about cybersecurity?
Yes, I'm actually going to kind of, so at Barnett Bank, I had sort of a CEO, we had Barnett Technologies. So we were actually a subsidiary of Barnett Bank. And so we had a profit and loss statement, even though we were, basically a captive. And the CEO of that company said something to me that I want to pass on to everybody here, because it really defines and shapes how I have conversations around security. And that is, he would say, we are bankers who do technology for a living. And so when you get up in the morning and you say, whatever industry you're currently working in, I'm a retailer who does cybersecurity for a living, you're going to show up differently at the table. And so if your focus is on business enablement, business resiliency, mitigating business risk, then you're a key partner at the table, and no one's going to want to have discussions around transformation, innovation, changing the business model without you there. That's very different from, I stop bad things from happening, so everybody goes through me before anything gets changed. Do you see there's a nuance there? You still have the same role. You still have the same responsibility. At the end of the day, your job is still the same. But if you want to be invited to the big kids table, the cool kids table, you have to get up and say, what does the operation that I work for, what do they do for a living? That's what I do for a living. And my specialty is cybersecurity. It will change the way you operate, and it will change how people interact with you.
That's great feedback. So as companies continue to digitally transform, there's obviously a heavier reliance on technology and the importance of a rugged security posture, and it becomes more and more critical. Throughout this pandemic, we've experienced over the last 2 years, there's only been an accelerated reliance on technology, remote interactions, much like we're doing here today. And, it's boosted our already hyper-connected world. What are your predictions around how this accelerated reliance on technology and this accelerated changes might impact cybersecurity and cyber threats in the future?
Yes. So Matt, you know this. I do predictions at the end of every year and I go 2 years out. So for example, my predictions for 2021 came at the end of 2019. My predictions at the end of last year for 2023. And my predictions do come true. Sometimes I get the years wrong. I'm either too slow or too fast. But they do come true. But Matt, if you're asking me to guess who's going to win the next Super Bowl or a lottery ticket, I have no gifts there. No gifts. So, so let's talk about 2023 because we're already squarely into 2022 and our reliance on different technologies. One of the things that is incredible to me is the fact that we're sending private sector citizens to outer space. That's incredible. One of the other things we're doing is we have a heavier reliance on low Earth orbit satellites, LEOs. And we're using them for all kinds of things people don't realize, right? So it's a rush to bring connectivity to parts of the world, including in America, rural America, that are currently disconnected for the most part. It fuels our GPS, it fuels communications. If you think about our semi-autonomous trucks for supply chain, ship navigation, they're relying more and more on these satellites. So my prediction for 2023 is that, cyber criminals always go where the action is. And my prediction is that these LEOs will be hacked. So space will be hacked next year.
Mhm.
So what do you do about that? Well, one of the things you can do now as a business is take that play and say, okay, what does that mean for us? If space is hacked, where in our ecosystem of what we do, how we do it, how we do our outreach, what's our backup plan? What if some portion of GPS, communications, navigation were to be out? How long could we operate as a business on our backup plans? What does that look like? Do we have an alternate? My prediction for 2022 is that a 5G city will actually be held for ransom and be offline for some extended period of time. So it's sort of the same thing. Where do you have either massive production, critical sort of pieces of the operation? Are they in cities that are moving very quickly to 5G infrastructure? And if they are, what's the backup plan? Sometimes having a second vendor doesn't actually mean you have a backup. You just have a second contract with a vendor that's on the same infrastructure. So those are the types of things in your playbook for business continuity and business resiliency you really need to be thinking about today.
Very cool. Yeah, I mean, oftentimes you think hackers would be more interested in, going after the money. You were in the banking industry, and as Willie Sutton once said, why does he rob banks? Because that's where the money is. You'd think that people would kind of go after that more often, but it seems like they're targeting more infrastructure. You referenced kind of space travel, Colonial Pipeline as an example. Healthcare and hospitals are constantly getting impacted, payroll companies and things like that. Why do you think that is? Why wouldn't they just go right after the money?
When you're obvious and you go after the money, at least in America, it's a federal offense. So if you get caught, significant jail time, right? So where do you go instead? You go after the consumers. So that doesn't mean the banks aren't under attack, because they absolutely are under attack every day, and they got to get it right every minute of every day. And they have to deal with everything from activists with a cause, hacktivists who might do distributed denial of service attacks, to, you could see as part of the Eastern European playbook playing out right now, you could see fake news produced, misinformation, disinformation, propaganda campaigns claiming that banks are offline, claiming that banks have been hit, trying to create runs on banks in Eastern Europe, which could spill over here. So those are the kinds of things that we really need to be thinking. Again, I always go back to what's in your playbook, how would this be disruptive to you, and you prepare for it. And what you can't prepare for and design for, you can always think about how do you insure for it.
Absolutely. Yeah, you mentioned social media. So with the prevalence of social media platforms, many folks are relying on these for sharing and consuming information, socially, politically, whatever it might be. Um, do you have any suggestions around how we may be able to protect ourselves from this misinformation, whether it's deep fakes, distorted truths, whatever it might be, designed to kind of influence our thoughts on election, health, sciences? You mentioned Eastern Europe and what's going on with Russia and things like that. How do we protect ourselves from this misinformation and not being manipulated?
Yeah, so for starters, I had to tell you one of the things, Matt, that surprises me. There is a whole cottage industry around fake company, fake persona. So taking a real legitimate company, standing up a fake company, standing up fake ads, fake personas, and either using it for, kind of like remote work scams, or using it to have people, give up personal information thinking they're applying for a job. Like, it's amazing to me just sort of how much from a social media perspective, and this creates a reputation risk. Like, we're working with a client right now who is in the kind of the startup phase of cryptocurrency, and there's a whole group of actors who are pretending to be them and telling people, apply here, give us your credit card, we'll send you equipment. The equipment's not showing up. I mean, it's a really challenging situation for them because you worry about reputation risk, but it's not them. It's somebody behaving as them. And you would think a takedown would be really simple, but it's not so simple, right? So you've got that going on. So I always tell people, if you're applying for jobs, red flags, things like, give me a credit card, so I'll send you a thing. Even doing your research anymore isn't always, kind of what it seems to be. Reach out to people you actually really know that may know somebody who works there. The second thing would be, people don't realize this, they say like, oh, it's not a big deal if I click on something. I'm just reading something or following a headline, right? That clickbait many times could be tied to a legitimate marketing campaign. But what we're seeing is that cyber criminal syndicates are actually buying the data that comes from that clickbait as part of third-party marketing services. And they're learning demographics about your employees, which allows them to do more sophisticated social engineering campaigns. So it's really important that people really think about, that whole headline of what everybody wore to the event last night. You won't believe this, or you won't believe what this politician said, or what this doctor said, or here's something that, the mainstream media doesn't want you to know. Those clickbait headlines could be legitimate, but understand the demographic data that is collected about you and your employees when they click on those links could be purchased and used as part of a social engineering campaign. And then lastly, I would say, always have multiple sources. So if you see something that makes you have some type of a emotional reaction, like, aha, I knew it, or that makes me mad, or just like, then you might be being manipulated, right? So always have an international, a national, and a local news source, so you can vet something that you're seeing and hearing. If you don't see it on those, chances are maybe you've witnessed manipulation information.
Yeah, great thoughts. So there's a lot of, you mentioned, Eastern Europe before. There's a lot of tension building over there, obviously. So what are your thoughts on how cyber warfare and cyber threats may impact kind of this ongoing battle in Eastern Europe?
Yeah, so this is not something going on in a faraway land. We know from past incidents, NotPetya would be one of them. So if people tuning in today have not been a victim of that and they're not sure what that is, that's actually a great case study to read and ask yourself whether or not you have exposure. So with NotPetya, Russian operatives infected a PDF at a Ukraine, it basically accounting in Ukraine has to go through a certain platform. And the next thing you know, it's spilled over. It just like a virus, it's hard to contain once you let it out of the lab, or out of a vial, or I get something and I meet people in person, I get a cold. It's hard to contain a cold once you're kind of out there. Sort of the same thing with the computer virus. And that ended up impacting huge global companies and having significant impacts. And so if you want to know whether or not stuff going on in Ukraine could indeed impact your organization or the ecosystem that your organization operates in, read up on NotPetya and then follow the advice and counsel. Bulletins are being put out all week this week by FBI. We've got joint bulletins that have been going out from the FBI, from the UK Cyber Center, Department of Homeland Security, CISA Division, NSA, CIA. I mean, the world is coming together and sharing intel as quickly as they can and really trying to boil it down to things that are very actionable.
Very good. And Nate, I know, we're past halfway through the hour. I don't want to consume all the time. I don't know if we want to start opening it up to the floor to see if there are other questions that folks may have.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Matt. Really appreciate that, Theresa. Awesome stuff so far. So everybody, we'll open it up now for Q&A. Feel free to come off mute. If you have a question, feel free to throw it in the chat. I've got a couple questions in the bank that people sent in via email. So we'll maybe start there and maybe people will get a little less shy as we get into it. So, and Theresa, I gave you a heads up on this one before the call, but this one I thought was great, which is how do you get humans with all their human tendencies to stop clicking on links? Is it a cultural change, training changes, something else? And I think there's a lot of people on this call that probably relate to that with their employees clicking links way too frequently. But I think it's a good question, and that seems to be the chink in the armor a lot of times. So, do you have any kind of suggestions on that?
I do. I mean, I think first, before that malicious link in an email ends up in an employee's mailbox, there's a couple of questions we can ask, right? And so one question is if it's coming in from the outside, have you taken advantage of putting headers on emails? So if you think you're getting an email from your CEO and you're about to click on a link to help out your CEO, but it says, warning, this came from outside your organization. So, human-centered design. How do we put safety nets around the human so that we limit how many of these malicious links actually end up for them as an individual to decision? So that's one. Another one is, and I've seen some organizations do this with success, that when you click on a link, that it actually opens it up in sort of a virtual machine instance, not on the desktop, not on the operating network instance. A little bit more, complicated for some organizations to do, depending on what your technology transformation efforts are, where you are in that journey, and kind of who you have to tap into for that. Another thing that you can do around the human is, again, sort of a reminder right before it gets launched. Are you sure you want to click on this link? Is you can also teach employees, both for their personal life and work life, that you can cut and paste links into tools like VirusTotal, which is free. And you can click it and then it'll tell you whether or not somebody else has reported it as malicious. So there are some steps that you can take. The other thing I often say is, depending on who has keys to the kingdom in your organization, they probably need a different set of training than sort of the training rollout you may do for the whole organization. So for example, people who do money movement, people who work on pricing, acquisitions, and merger activities, intellectual property, anything that has to do with very, very sensitive operations, they should probably get sort of just in time customized training and a set of protocols, sort of a, hey, the CEO will never send you an email out of the blue asking you to send him the payroll files. He's just never going to do that. So that's not him. So sometimes, like we did this at the White House, we hired an adult learning expert to help us figure out how can we, in 5 minutes or less, like teach people good digital hygiene. And one of the things they said is sometimes telling people the things you will never do actually sticks with them better than telling them all the things that are legitimate. So just saying, hey, we'll never do these things. Then people go, my CEO would never do this. So that's not him. And then thinking about those different things you could do to create those safety nets, those alerts and warnings. End user education awareness training is helpful if you can keep it interesting, fresh, short, and frequent. Not once a year, here's 2 hours of training and your boss is going to get mad at you if you're late doing it. Keep it fresh, keep it interesting, keep it short and frequent can really go a long way.
Awesome. Awesome. I think that that was a good answer. But I think, we're still battling against human nature on that one. Huh? All right. So a couple others in the bank, and people, don't hesitate to come off mute. You've got a chance to talk to Theresa here. It's, kind of a once in a lifetime opportunity. So do not hesitate to come off mute. Next question I have in the bank is, I've heard suggested that having excellent IT processes could negate an organization's need for cybersecurity professionals. With your background in both IT and cybersecurity, what do you think of that kind of idea?
Yes. I mean, once I'm not needed anymore, I've thought about being a National Park Service ranger because they get to be outside a lot more than I do. And I love horses and national parks. So I love that idea. But in all seriousness, though, I love the question. And it kind of ties back to something Matt and I were talking about earlier, which is, how do we kind of get to sort of the beginning, right? So when we're doing our technology rollouts and implementations, how do we have security in there by design on the IT side so that you don't need sort of security after the fact? And I agree. So for example, if you have your own development shop or rely upon third-party shops for development, asking them who's doing the trust but verify on code builds, who's doing the trust but verify that when you're using open source codes and widget, and you're integrating those into the build, that you really know that it's secure by design. So I agree with you. The more that you can do on the front end, the better off you're going to be on the cybersecurity side, and the less intrusive it's going to feel. Strong passwords feel icky and clunky and not fun. Having behavioral-based analytics up front and things that say, I'm sorry, I don't recognize, this device. I don't recognize the location. I don't recognize a lot of things. So I'm going to make it harder for this person. But then this person, I'm going to make it a little bit more simplistic and easy and elegant because there's a lot of things that the boxes are already checked. And then depending on the behavioral based analytics, then I'll start to escalate how much I ask for from them. So you can see you're still getting to the same place, but instead of putting the burden on the human, you put the burden on how you built things back in the IT infrastructure and operations. So I think it's a great question, a great point, and I'm glad you brought that up, Nathan, and whoever kind of posed that question.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I think it makes sense. All right, guys, I'm gonna keep saying it every time before I ask a question, but don't hesitate to come off mute. We try to keep this nice and small, nice and intimate. So, come off mute, ask some questions.
Nathan, there. So Peter put in here, you hack crypto, and so one of my other predictions is that there will actually be sort of this forgery replacement of real things on the blockchain, so that basically the hashing algorithm that is used today to store NFTs, important documents on the blockchain, cryptocurrency, that cyber criminal syndicates will actually figure it out, and they'll actually be able to pull the real like NFT and replace it with a forgery before anybody realizes what has happened. Think about it as sort of like a, kind of Hollywood movie on a great art museum heist where, somebody decides they're going to steal Monets and Picassos and replace them with forgeries. And you sort of watch them get away with it. So that's one of the predictions that I have, is that, there's a lot about blockchain that's pretty incredible right now. It's also environmentally not very friendly because of the computer processing power that is required, but also it's not super consumable. I mean, most people, with it, when they click on, I want to purchase, and if they don't get an instant, your purchase has gone through and here's your notification and here's your shipping and tracking, they're like, what's wrong with this thing, right? If it doesn't happen within 60 seconds. And for those of you who have interacted with the blockchain is not super consumable right now. You can't, give things at lightning speed that people want to access that are on the blockchain. So it'll be interesting to see where it goes. And Peter, thanks for that comment there.
Yeah, awesome. Another question that came in privately to me through the chat here was, and again, that you can share coolest or craziest story from the time at the White House. Obviously with that caveat that you can share. Yeah.
So this is kind of an interesting, funny story. A lot of people don't know this about the White House, but very much if you're like a Downton Abbey fan, there is truly an usher's office that operates that people don't see. And when I'm big on doing walkabouts. And so I went over and I asked the usher's office if somebody could give me a tour so I could understand all of the technology and that I had in place for the usher's office. And while I'm in there, I'm looking around and I notice there's barcodes on everything. So I go into the White House flower shop so that you have your own flower shop, and there's florists who are so talented in there and just building these beautiful arrangements for everything. And I see her, she like scans a flower stem and cuts the scan, the little sticker off and then makes the flower arrangement. And I'm like, oh, I get it. I read a lot of spy novels. I know what this is. It's to make sure there's no anthrax in the flowers. I bet you that's it. So then I go into the kitchen and I see in the kitchen, they're getting ready for lunch and dinners and all these things that go on at the White House. And I noticed like all the chicken breasts in the fridge and the filet mignons, like those same looking barcodes are on everything in the kitchen. And I'm like, maybe this is to make sure nobody poisons the president. I go through like the pantry and I see like the president's brand of toothpaste that he prefers and the first lady's, all barcoded. So I'm like, Admiral, what is up? So at the Admiral that was running the usher's office, and I said, the barcodes, what is up with the barcodes? And he says, I said, it looks like we produce them. Is that something like my team is producing? And he says, yeah. And I said, can I guess what it's for? He goes, yeah, sure, go ahead. And I said, okay, it's got to be to make sure like the president doesn't get poisoned or something. And he's like, good one, that's not it. And I was like, okay, I know if like the queen is over for dinner, we don't want to run out of filet mignon for, everybody that's there for dinner. So it's like supply chain. He's like, great idea, but that's not it. And I said, okay, what is it? And he said, well, depending on who eats the chicken at lunch, let's say it's a political lunch, that's one bucket of money. So we have to scan the barcodes and record it against like political bucket of money. If it's filet mignon for the queen, that's a totally different bucket of money because it's a visiting foreign head of state. So we got to make sure we scan the barcode. And I'm like, these are American taxpayer dollars at work, right? So trying to make sure the right buckets of money are used. But my story about that is then I realized I have this like overwhelming responsibility. We're modernizing the usher's office, but I cannot let get out the logistics supply chain that I have down here. It could be dangerous to have somebody know, where do we get the toothpaste from? What is the president's preferred brand of toothpaste, toilet paper? Like what's in the family's pantry? It would be very dangerous if that system were to be compromised. And so, I mean, I kind of had like a little chuckle about it, but at the same time, this overwhelming sense of responsibility of, there's an element here that I didn't even think of existed for my job. So that's something I can share with you. It was like kind of one of my most interesting, and challenging moments. The other ones, not yet, got to wait, I think 25 more years or something like that. So.
Okay. All right. I thought this one was really good. In a world of state actors targeting private companies, does the U.S. government have a responsibility to help protect U.S. businesses?
So this is an interesting one. Yes, to a degree. So the challenge around that is most of the United States infrastructure is owned by private sector companies. AT&T, Verizon, right? Qualcomm, yeah, Comcast, you name it. So a big part of the infrastructure is run by private sector. And we don't really have a construct in place in our laws around Department of Defense standing in front of private sector companies, right? Department of Defense is supposed to be, defending, kind of outside the borders, right? And American interests. So we have a real challenge where our social constructs, our Constitution, our laws don't really account for the fact that nation states are attacking private companies, private individuals, and nonprofits. And we do have to get to the bottom of this. So yes, they have a responsibility to, as much as possible, declassify intel to help businesses prepare. But standing in front of the businesses is a tricky proposition based on the laws and the constructs we have today. It could be done. I don't see and I don't mean this political as party political. I mean, I just don't see the political will and grit and determination on any side of any aisle and people in the middle to sit down and really hammer that out. It may unfortunately actually require some type of a catastrophic event before we figure it out, which is unfortunate.
Yep, that makes sense. Kind of on that same infrastructure topic, do you foresee like AWS, Azure, GCP, the major public cloud providers? Do you foresee any cyber attacks resulting in some long-term outages there? I imagine that, that those have to be a high priority target right now.
Yeah, I mean, God bless anybody who's in charge of major infrastructure, whether it's cloud or, kind of on-prem data centers. Tough job. We've already seen high profile, large scale outages of cloud services providers, cyber attack or not, right? So from availability, resiliency, and reliability, they have some of the same challenges I used to face in banking. There are certain systems in banking that the regulators would say, our expectation of you is you have to have 99.9999 to the 6th decimal place availability. Wow. Okay. Well, that's really hard to do things like, I don't know, update, patch, transform, innovate if everybody expects you to have no downtime. So they're in a real kind of sticky position where they fuel a lot of the global economy. They are a high value target. You saw with somebody who was a contractor of Amazon, who sort of knew the ins and outs, who was able to access data and dump that data on the internet. Capital One was caught up in that. So sometimes you don't even need like highly sophisticated cyber trained operatives or nation state funded operatives. Sometimes the resiliency, recoverability efforts are a problem. And sometimes just like good old fashioned, who has access to your data and do they know the side doors that are typically left unlocked for system support? So yeah, I do. And one of the things I recommend is consider having more than one cloud services provider for different core elements of your operation. So for example, the one that runs your operating production environment, maybe they're not the one that runs your off-site stored backups environment. Maybe you have one cloud services provider for all of your office productivity software and something different for certain types of data elements. So only each organization knows what's best for you, understanding your user stories, then your enterprise architecture, then your data architecture, and then what you want for business continuity to understand who are the right cloud services providers. But I do recommend having more than one in the event that there is a significant outage on one or more of the cloud services providers.
Yeah, that makes sense. Next question that I have, and guys, we're getting pretty close. If a lot of people are sending me questions in direct message, but again, still feel free to unmute and ask yourself. Um, the next question is around APIs, and since they're being rapidly adopted, how can APIs, including shadow APIs, be securely managed in an attempt to prevent vulnerabilities from turning into security incidents? And when it comes to developing APIs for use in mission critical applications, should there be restrictions on citizen developers versus professional developers? So that was kind of the question there.
Yeah, this gets back to kind of old fashioned. How do you think about your development life cycle, and how do you think about code builds and quality assurance and quality control? And where do you do security assurance? My recommendation is that you start security assurance with the development team. So one of the things you can do is actually give them a framework and say, I'm holding you accountable to secure coding standards, including how APIs are invoked, how APIs are segmented off. So because you can leverage an API in such a way where, again, you can tokenize its access, right? So you don't have to have the API be wide open, have wide open access to what it's trying to do for its function. Now, many developers, a lot of times they're just focused on, you gave me requirements, I'm coding to spec. So you have to give them that framework that says, I want it to behave this way. And this is the framework for secure coding by design. So it's almost, kind of at the front before anybody's doing anything. If you already have stuff built, a little trickier, right? So one of the things to do is say, as we build new things, here's the standard coding secure by design. But then this is where you can do peer reviews. So if you're not ready to actually red team and ethically hack and focus on the APIs as part of that red team, if you're not ready for that yet, that's okay. Do a peer review. And they don't even have to be technical resources. It can be the business unit that the application has the APIs and it's serving sort of that business unit is responsible for it. Have them ask questions. So then what happens? And then how does it get invoked? And then what happens? And what happens to the data? How do we know that it's secure? How do we know the API isn't doing other things behind the scenes? How do we make sure it's not a black box to us? And sometimes those peer reviews actually work better than a red team, because that's where you really unearth kind of both usability, privacy, and security issues. So that's a baby step, peer reviews, and then, the code, secure coding by design. And then the last piece is you got to red team it, make sure it's really operating the right way.
Okay, awesome. So we've gone 58 minutes without, I don't think I've heard the word ransomware yet. We're 10 years in to this ransomware crisis, doesn't seem to be going anywhere. So what is your, how do you protect against it? Is it something that's here to stay? What's your, take on this whole ransomware crisis?
It's here to stay. Very few people get locked up and put in jail for doing it. We don't know what ransomware is really funding. It's hard to follow the money, but it's definitely part of, kind of the larger global crime element, helps them launder money. It could be funding other things like human trafficking. So it's a very serious situation. How much money has been turned over to ransomware syndicates? I don't judge any victim who feels like they were stuck in an untenable situation and felt forced to pay. And I can't imagine what that's like, to feel like you were forced to pay. I've certainly talked to CEOs who I met like after that decision was made, and it was agonizing for them. Nobody wants to pay the bully because they know they're just going to come back. And you're dealing with dishonest people to begin with. So how do you know they're going to keep their word that they're not going to dump your data or come back? So ransomware is here to stay, but what can you do about it is more importantly. So first of all, having a playbook that you rehearse with your senior executives is really important. Getting them to understand how serious it is, what your general counsel is going to say, what your PR, corporate communications is going to say, whether or not your insurance company will pay. In some cases, insurance companies, end up suing the victim and saying you were in violation of terms and we're not going to pay. So it's really important to have, you can take a staff meeting, elongate it, and just sort of even have conversations without a sophisticated playbook. The second thing that we looked at, because we get the crisis calls around ransomware, is that once we do the forensics, help them recover and get back online, and we do the forensics, the typical entry points over this pandemic have been remote access platforms that are misconfigured. We've seen password spraying, password reuse, bypassing multi-factor authentication, in some cases tricking people into giving up codes using social engineering on email. So I always say a great thing to do is to kind of revisit, how do you allow people who are accessing your corporate information, how many password login attempts do you allow? Do you have somebody who tracks a log that looks at how, are there busy days where there's lots of password login attempts that just reach like times three, but there's a lot of them? That could be a sign that you're kind of under some active surveillance for ransomware. So there's lots that you can do that doesn't require opening up a checkbook and buying new things. Certainly you can invest in tools and frameworks and technology, but looking at sort of your password hygiene, red teaming, you can ask your own internal team to, kind of red team how the remote access is working, whether or not they can get past the tools and technologies you've already put in place. And then, kind of the last thing I would tell people is having stored your backups out of band, where criminals, if they get access to your network, can't look for your backups first and lock them up. So out of band, not accessible that way, encrypted with some type of a multi-factor authentication. Maybe it requires, like, Matt and Nathan have to get on a video conference and they've got pictures of you guys and you guys got code words, something that takes 5 minutes to do, but it's pre-planned in advance. So somebody can't just get access to your backups. And then have a real honest to goodness discussion around, so if they dump our data, we will ask the court of public opinion to forgive us because we didn't pay the cyber criminals, and we'll have to deal with the fallout. But that also goes to, what are your digital data destruction strategies? Everybody's kind of got grandma's attic right now of data because storage is cheap. And then what are your data at rest and data at motion strategies? Are you leveraging encryption and machine-to-machine multi-factor authentication wherever possible? So those are the strategies. Those are the winning strategies. And I will tell you, I know ransomware victims from the last 2 years who had many of those strategies in place, and you didn't read about them in the headlines. They stayed out of the headlines for the most part because they were able to say, okay, this is what we do. Here's the data they got. Guess what? It's encrypted. So the chances of them having usable data is debatable. I will also tell you just another quick story, Nathan, just as we're kind of coming up the end. Things are not always as they appear. So we had a CEO call us and he said, I don't want to pay. I want you to help me not have to pay. And they gave us a link. Can you guys go check it out? So while I'm working with him and his team on a strategy not to pay, my incident response team goes to the dark web link, and it's not the company's data. It's not anybody they do business with. It's actually a different victim. It's literally like misfiling in the filing cabinet, an old school filing cabinet. And so we went back and we said, do we have permission to tell that victim? Because we looked and their systems don't look to be locked up. They're going to be the next victim. He said, sure. So we contacted them, said, can't tell you how we know, but we got a link. It's got your data. You need to go into incident response. And then we basically said, shh, let's not tell them they lost your data for right now because they might find it. And we just basically did a quiet restore. And then basically they typically dump the data 28 days after a ransomware event, and it's been more than 28 days. So things are not always as they appear.
Wow.
Wow. Crazy, crazy stuff. Crazy stuff. All right. Well, we want to be cognizant of the 5 o'clock hour here. Theresa, thank you so much for your time. Matt, thanks for kind of moderating with Theresa. And yeah, everybody, we recorded this, so we'll throw out a little recording. You can share with your teams. I think there's a lot of cool stuff on here. I can't believe we made it 58 minutes without talking about ransomware, but I had to stick that last one in there. Yeah, and thank you again, Theresa, and we'll talk to everybody soon.
Yeah, again,
Thanks.
thank you everyone for joining, and a special thanks to you, Theresa. It was great to speak with you today. Obviously very knowledgeable in the cybersecurity space, so we really appreciate your insight.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. And you know what? You've got a great thought leader here in EchoStor, so make sure you're taking advantage of all of the research and the work and the talent that they have there. And thank you for inviting me to be with you guys today. Take care, be safe, be well, be healthy.
You as well.
Thank you.
Take care.